This afternoon I've got no notes. I haven't taken any notes at all. Or you could possibly say that I've been taking notes for the last 20 years or so, since I wrote my last book. And here are my notes, at long last, published by Yale University Press. So in essence, I'm going to be telling you what's in this book. Some of you who haven't heard me before are dying to ask me, and somebody just did ask me, in fact, Chris, are you for Noam Chomsky or against him? And yeah, that's a very natural question to ask, because just about everything else I can think of that's been written on Noam Chomsky has indeed been either for him, totally, ardently for, both his politics and his linguistics. There's a whole raft of books, the best probably of which is Neil Smith, Noam Chomsky, Ideas and Ideals, but there's countless others. Or they've been ferociously hostile to Noam's politics as well as his linguistics. So Paul Postel, for example, was an ex-close colleague, almost number two in the hierarchy, I suppose, with Noam Chomsky, who describes Noam as essentially un-American. All his activities are un-American activities, and his linguistics is junk linguistics. And I think it's fair to say that this is the first balanced book on Noam Chomsky. I mean, maybe you can point to another one, but I myself, I've looked around, I haven't come across any work on Noam Chomsky which isn't either hagiography or kind of hate crime. I mean, just total denunciation of the man. So I need to start by saying I love Noam Chomsky. And actually, you might smile a little bit. I can see Stan smiling a little bit here, but I'm telling the truth. I might be watching television. I've seen some US drone strike on a wedding party in Afghanistan. I've seen some terrible crime perpetrated from the air in Syria or Iraq or somewhere by American imperialism. Or a crime of the Israeli state in occupied West Bank or Gaza. And I'm kind of crying my eyes out over all this, as one does when you watch what's going on in the world. And then, onto the screen comes Noam Chomsky. And I have to say, there he is, speaking loud and clear, in a kind of monotone, absolutely steadfast, saying it like it is. And as his admirers say, speaking truth to power. In a way, you can say we shouldn't need a Noam Chomsky. If the politicians were honest, if they told the truth, if the mass media weren't so mendacious, you know, if ordinary people could get the truth directly from people's mouths, from the media, the newspapers, we wouldn't need a Noam Chomsky. But of course, we know that politicians lie. And the media are professional liars for the most part. And so there's not much question about it. We need Noam Chomsky, and if he didn't exist, we would have to invent one of those, because the truth does need to be told. So I love Noam Chomsky. He's a great figure. I mean, what other academic, with quite a lot to lose, you might think, says it like it is, with such extraordinary tenacity and courage over the generations. I mean, he's been around since the late 50s, and he's still today as fit as ever, apparently, you know, again, speaking truth to power. So what's my book all about? Well, Noam himself makes it fairly clear that there are two Noam Chomskys. In an interview, he kind of admitted with, I think, a bit of perhaps a smile, he said, when somebody asked him how he manages to do so many different things all at once, he said, so I think I'm different from other people in that there's a kind of glitch in my brain which makes it work like two parts of a computer with buffers between the two bits. So he's got one brain for one lot of stuff, and another bit of his brain, he says this, as if it's like two modules in a computer for doing the other stuff. And as he flips between the science and the linguistics, he has said in another interview, I lead a pretty schizophrenic life. And in fact, an interviewer once said to Noam, Noam, what do you say? He was talking to the activists now. Noam, the activist, what do you say when you meet the other Chomsky, the scientist? And he says, there's no connection. We've got nothing to say to each other. So I'm not the only one who says that there are two Noam Chomskys. Noam himself it's very clear that there are two Noam Chomskys. And the depth of the paradox becomes clear when we realise that the one Noam Chomsky is the one that most of you know, most activists, socialists, Marxists, Corbynists know about Noam Chomsky, the political activist. There's the other one, and this one, of course, has spent his life denouncing the US military. And that's what he mostly does. And he's got a point. He says it's easy enough criticising the crimes of other people, other people's governments, other countries. The job is to nail the crimes made in your name. In his case, his name. So he devotes most of his attention to the crimes of the Pentagon or the US government over the years. But the paradox is that the man who's made his reputation as the world's probably most prominent dissident by criticising the US military is also the man who spent his whole life, ever since he got a job, working in, I want to spell this out, probably the main weapons of mass destruction laboratory on the planet. Massachusetts Institute of Technology's electronics lab was a massive source of all the most ingenious helicopter stabilization machines, multiple weapons, guidance systems, really everything that happened to make kind of Ronald Reagan salivate over the prospect of Star Wars. The inventions were being incubated inside the electronics lab that Chomsky has spent his life working in. So we have this paradox. One of the Chomskys has been attacking the US military, the other has spent his life working in a military laboratory. So to ask me whether I'm for Noam Chomsky or against him is a little bit too simple. There are two Noam Chomskys, one I'm very warm about and admiring of, and the other I have some questions to ask in connection with. I'm not going to start at the beginning of my book. I'm going to start with a chapter fairly near the middle. In fact, it's actually chapter 5, the cognitive revolution. And I'm doing this to clarify to a political audience who the other Chomsky that you know much less about is. So I'm always a bit surprised when I talk to Marxists, socialists, people who support Jeremy Corbyn, Occupy activists, Green activists, as I do. I'm always careful not to really start by talking about the cognitive revolution, because if I talk about the cognitive revolution, your eyes glaze over. What the hell is that? It's really strange that you've never heard, I'm sure some of you have, but in a sense, you in the broad sense, it's really strange that you've never heard of the cognitive revolution, because it's only the biggest intellectual upheaval that's happened since Galileo told us that the Earth is round and it moves. So most people, most young people, probably around the entire planet these days, they know a little bit about digital technology. I mean, there may be parts of the Amazon or parts of Africa or somewhere, you know, but even outside cities, most young people know roughly what digital communication is, what a compact disc is, what a hard drive is, maybe what a mobile phone is, maybe now, more recently, what a tablet is, what a computer is. And yet, still haven't heard of the cognitive revolution. And the thing about the cognitive revolution, it's just the impact of the computer revolution on human thought. It's the huge impact which the invention of computers, obviously starting with Alan Turing in this country, the invention of digital computers has revolutionized the way we, people, philosophers, cognitive scientists, psychologists, even anthropologists, archaeologists, think about what it means to be human. So let me just explain a little bit about this. There's something about digital communication which is kind of strange. Probably you know that if you have a vinyl disc and you have a make a pressing from it, and you make a pressing from the pressing, and pressing from the pressing. After a while, you can't hear the music. It will degrade with each copy you make. Or if you have a photocopy, you take the thing out of the photocopier, you put it back on, you take out the copy, and you put it back on. After a while, you've had a copy of a copy of a copy, and of course, the same as the old video films, you can't see what's supposed to be there. The pattern's lost. With a digital starting point and a digital copy, you make this copy, that copy, the other copy, doesn't matter how many copies, you can make 1,000,000 copies. All the copies are perfect copies. You either get a copy or you don't get a copy. And that's because digital means off and on. It means all the signals are either fully on or fully off, and there's no intermediate position. So a digital photograph or a digital disc is just lots and lots of little off and on switches, and anyone that's on is totally on, and anyone that's off is totally off, and so you can't degrade it. Linked to that is the idea, or the fact in reality, that with digital transmission of information, it makes not a blind bit of difference what the medium is. In other words, what the material in which the signal is encoded is. So with a digital signal, whether it's copper, aluminium, fiberglass, optical cable, water, throwing pillars up and down in the air, pigeons pecking or not pecking, the offs are offs and the ons are ons, and it doesn't matter whether the off is a smoke signal or a pigeon or a pillow or whatever it is, it's either off or on, and as long as you can tell the difference, you're getting the full message. So you have the autonomy of the information with respect to the material in which the information is encoded. And so you have information floating free of matter. Well, when philosophers began to think about that, especially in America in the 50s, when they began to realize what the potential of digital computers was, they began to think, possibly this has solved the great problem which Descartes faced long ago, and the Greeks faced, and probably people have faced since philosophy began, the great problem of the relationship between matter and mind. Possibly mind is digital information, or if you like, software. And body is the information's material, the stuff, the matter within which the information is encoded, or if you like, hardware. So maybe mind is to matter as software is to hardware. If you've got good software, it doesn't too much matter how heavy your computer is. As long as it works, as long as the operating system allows it to work, you can kind of ignore the hardware because the software is all you're interested in. And just possibly to illustrate where this took people began to think that really humans are software installed on hardware, in which case we've solved that age-old philosophical problem. The link between mind and body is not a mystery. Anyone who's got a computer with some software in it knows that what the computer does is determined by the software. This is just from my book. Behind this is the deeper assumption that we are just software, in which case we can discard our physical body while preserving who we are. Take cognitive scientist Marvin Minsky, brilliant co-founder in 1958 of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Described as the father of artificial intelligence, Minsky's main interest lay in building computer models capable of replicating the activities of human beings. Among other things, he was a scientist who advised Stanley Kubrick on the capabilities of the HAL computer in his 1968 film 2001, A Space Odyssey. Minsky entertained beliefs that were unshakable because they stemmed logically from the assumptions taken for granted by everyone at the time. If the mind really is a digital computer, then our bodies no longer really matter. Our arms, legs and brain cells are just perishable and imperfect hardware, essentially irrelevant to the weightless and immortal software the information which constitutes who we really are. And I must go on a little bit longer, if you forgive me reading up from my book. At a public lecture delivered by Minsky in 1996, quite recently, relatively recently, on the eve of the 5th Conference on Artificial Life in Nara, Japan, he, this is Minsky, argued that only since the advent of computer languages have we been able to properly describe human beings. A person is not a head and arms and legs, he remarked. That's trivial. A person is a very large multiprocessor with 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 small parts, and these are arranged in 1,000 computers. End of quote. It's not surprising then that Minsky dreams of banishing death by downloading consciousness into a computer. Quote, this is from Minsky, the most important thing about each person is the data, and the programs in the data that are in the brain. And someday you will be able to take all that data and put it on a little disk and store it for 1,000 years, and then turn it on again, and you will be alive in the 4th millennium or the 5th millennium. So you can see the heady dreams that have emanated from this conception that we humans are computers with software and hardware, and who cares about the hardware? You can always install it somewhere else. Right. The point I'm making is this. That stuff would have just been of interest to computer nerds, technicians, engineers producing their little gadgets, of no wider philosophical interest, had we not had Noam Chomsky. Because Chomsky was the man who connected all that stuff up with what it means to be human. Because it was Chomsky who, with a great deal of authority, managed to persuade the scientific community that inside the human brain is a digital computer. And not just somewhere in the brain. The main thing about we humans is that we have language. And the language emanates from the language organ in the brain, which is a digital computer. Right. Now, can you see what I'm saying now? What I'm saying is that this had to be true. The reason it had to be true was because of the whole show wouldn't have been of much interest to philosophers, anthropologists, cognitive psychologists, people who are interested in children, how they acquire. All that stuff about digital computers would have applied to digital computers, not to humans, and therefore wouldn't have had this huge philosophical significance had not Chomsky bridged the gap. He bridged the gap with the argument that he had, I won't quite say proved, he never quite used the word proved, but he had found, or he had reason to suppose, powerful reasons to suppose, very powerful reasons to suppose, that the reason why a child is able to quickly acquire the grammar of its natal language is because inside that child is a digital computer which knows it already. It's already hardwired with the essence of grammar, in fact of all the world's grammars. That had to be true, because otherwise the show wouldn't have got off the ground. Everyone in this field of cognitive psychology, as it's now called, in other words, the kind of psychology which is based on the idea that the brain is a digital computer, everyone involved on computational linguistics, all that stuff, they were standing on ground. That ground was Noam Chomsky. His claim that a digital computer is installed in the head of every human being on Earth from birth. It had to be true. And you'll find to this day the same thing. It just has to be true. Now, I want to say to Marxists, one of the consequences of this cognitive revolution, what the consequences have been. And again, I want to stress, it seems to me so sort of strange that Marxists have had something done to them across the world, which they're hardly even aware of. What we've had done to us as Marxists since the end of the Second World War is we've had done to us the removal of science. Marxists never talk these days, as far as I know, I do, but I don't know too many other people, of science as the inspiration behind their activism. And when I say science, I mean science. I mean what other people call science, what astronomers, geneticists, molecular biologists, physical chemists, call it, in other words, a huge collective enterprise, which these days has worked out more or less what happened in the first nanoseconds after the Big Bang, which can look at the whole universe and roughly work out how galaxies formed, how the solar system formed. Science as in modern genetics, science as scientists mean, science as in, for example, the modern science of climate change. And my own view is that there's nothing more revolutionary, no more revolutionary form of knowledge than actual, real science. It's the most revolutionary thing there is. And yet Marxists very rarely, they used to, we used to, our grandparents probably did in the 20s and 30s, take a huge interest in astronomy, a huge interest in genetics, and of course many of the astronomers and geneticists were actually Marxists, of course. Think of Haldane, think of Maynard Smith, a massive figure in modern evolutionary biology. But Western Marxists, the people who carried on in some form the Marxist tradition into Western culture and philosophy, science, forget it. No interest in science. Why did that happen, and how did it happen? How was it that this catastrophe occurred to Marxism such that we no longer really even hear science or think it matters to keep up with science? We think we can do something different and still be Marxists. Very different from what Marx and Engels did, of course, and they were always keeping absolutely abreast of the very most recent cutting-edge developments in science. Obviously, particularly anthropology, that most affects humans, but also geology, astronomy, and so forth. What went wrong? How did it all happen? Well, again, the cognitive revolution saw to it that that connection between science and activism was ruptured. And the person who most symbolized the cognitive revolution, who was the standard bearer for that cognitive revolution, was Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky's fundamental thesis is that science, although of enormous interest if you're a scientist, and he says that to be a scientist you have to have a certain module in your head called the science forming capacity. Not everyone's got it. Some of you can probably understand science, but you can't really do science, you haven't got this particular computer module in your head. But although, but what he says is that science, although interesting to people who've got a thing about science, when activists say to him, "No, what about your linguistics? What about this phenomenal new science that you invented?" He says, "None of your business, basically. Just don't worry about it. It's got no significance, no interest to humans. So it's one of my kind of hobbies. I know other scientists find these things fascinating, but don't bother about it. It's got no significance." And essentially, science and life pass each other by. There's no connection. Science can only, as he puts it, deal with very simple questions, and there are no political implications emanating from science as he understands that term. So a complete disjunct between science and activism. And the point I'm making is that the reason why that became so seductive was because Chomsky was able to intermesh it, link it to this amazing discovery of digital computers. Because with digital computers, the information is one thing, the body, the matter, the material, and all that stuff is another. Information doesn't weigh anything. You can't weigh information. Information doesn't occupy space, it just zips through the speed of light. And information kind of passes by the matter within which it interacts with, the matter that the information is encoded in. So you have this radical disjunct between software and hardware, or information and matter, or, if you like, between theory and practice. So Noam Chomsky says that his activism is in my view, brave and hugely valuable denunciations of the crimes of his own government. He says this has got nothing interesting to do with his scientific work. And his scientific work has got nothing to do with his political activism, because his scientific work on language has got no political significance. It's politically neutral, it's devoid of interest to people whose commitment is to activism. So far does Chomsky take the decontamination of science, and in his case the decontamination of linguistics, decontamination of all social significance, all political significance. So far does he push that he removes from language anything which even could remotely be political. How would you do that? How would you say that language is completely devoid, not only of political significance, but even of social significance? I mean, you're looking at me possibly a bit puzzled. Language is people, it's like me, I'm talking to you, I'm using language. We use language to share our thoughts. It's an amazing, whatever it is. It could be, it's kind of a biological development, of course. Our brains are actually, human brains are very good at picking up the grammar of a language. Chimpanzees are hopeless at it, so it's clearly partly biological. Clearly it's partly a cultural invention as well. But certainly language is social. You have a speaker and a hearer, and even if I'm talking to myself, I'm imagining I'm somebody listening to myself. One of the things about language is you can talk to yourself, of course you can, but when you do that, you're kind of putting yourself, you're rehearsing how your words will be heard by other people. You're still social. One bit of yourself may be talking to another. Chomsky says that language is not social. It's an object in the head. Not only that, it's an object in the head of the individual. And so possibly I'll just read out, just for you to get a flavour of it, some of the points that he makes about language. These are the fundamental. I've moved now, right? I'm not talking about Chomsky the activist, it's the other person. So these are his commitments. Insofar as linguistics is a truly scientific discipline, it is restricted to the study of I language. I meaning individual and internal, a system of knowledge internal to the individual. And so to quote him, to summarise, we may think of a person's knowledge of a particular language as a state of the mind realised in some arrangement of physical mechanisms. We extract the I language as what is known by a person in this state of knowledge. This finite system, the I language, is what the linguist's generative grammar attempts to characterise. So if you're a linguist, you're never interested in people talking to each other. You're only interested in this thing in the head, and that's all. It's inside the individual skull. At a deeper level, scientific linguistics is the study of universal grammar, UG as it's abbreviated, defined as the innate cognitive equipment enabling humans to acquire such an I language. But to quote from Noam, the study of generative grammar shifted the focus of attention from people talking to each other to the system of knowledge that underlies the use and understanding of language, and more deeply to the innate endowment that makes it possible for humans to attain such knowledge. UG is a characterization of these innate, biologically determined principles which constitute one component of the human mind, the language faculty. He admits the mind's got lots of digital computers in, one for science, one for language, one for various other things, maybe one for morality, for example. There's a morality computer in there. But the one he's interested in is the language organ. Scientific linguistics is therefore a branch of natural science, absolutely crucial. All science for Noam Chomsky has to be natural science. Set apart from social anthropology or sociology, it excludes investigation of human social interaction, politics, communication, or culture. In particular, it has no place for the popular notion of E-languages, external languages such as Chinese, Swahili, or English, conceived as culturally distinct traditions. Rather, as he puts it, all scientific approaches have simply abandoned these elements of what is called language in common uses. So you and I might think that languages are things like French and Chinese and English and German and stuff. He said, forget all that, nothing to do with it. Those are externalizations. We are interested in the internal thing inside the head of the individual. And for every single individual on planet Earth, it's the same thing. A Martian looking at humans would just say, these humans have got one language. It's a universal language in the head. But nobody actually talks to each other, but they've all got the same language. Linguistic variation is superficial. And to quote Chomsky, the Martian scientists might reasonably conclude that there is a single human language with differences only at the margins. What he says actually is that all humans have the same language. They don't need to pronounce it, because of course if you're talking to yourself you don't need to make sounds. But insofar as there are differences, the difference between German and Swahili or Arabic or some other language are just differences in pronunciation. But because you don't need to pronounce, because you just talk to yourself, we can forget all that. Strictly speaking, a child doesn't need to learn from others how to speak its native tongue, since it's equipped with the basics already. To quote Chomsky again, learning language is something like undergoing puberty. You don't learn to do it, you don't do it because you see other people doing it, you're just designed to do it at a certain time. So as you reach the age of 1 or 2 as a little baby, things grow in you, one of them being eye language, one of them being the language organ. And he says you can know English perfectly without having heard a word, because it's already in your head. So, extensions and elaborate. What I'm giving you, I'm just giving you the sort of basics of Chomskyan linguistics, the philosophical underpinnings of his whole life's work. So these are some extensions of these basic assumptions. The child acquires its native tongue by discarding one language after another from the vast repertoire of tongues installed in its head from birth. Listen to this is the most amazing one. It's pretty clear that a child approaches the problem of language acquisition by having all possible languages in its head, but doesn't know which language it's being exposed to. And as data comes along, that class of possible languages reduces. So, certain data comes along, it means you're hearing little snatches of sound, and the mind automatically says, oh, okay, it's not that language, it's some other language. So the child's equipped at birth with all the languages that ever were, all the languages that are, all the languages that ever will be, and it has to just gradually get rid of all these languages until it's only got the one that it's actually in, which might be, for example, English. Another segment. Now, by the way, I want to say, my point here in reading out these things isn't to say they're daft, they're bonkers, they're nonsense. My point isn't that at all, by the way. It's to ask a different question. Why does this particular kind of nonsense emerge in America in the late 50s and early 60s, and then become dominant throughout the Western world? I'm saying it's nonsense is pointless. You can just argue till the cows come home and say it's nonsense. Other people say it's not nonsense. I want to know what it was, socially, institutionally, politically. The way I put it at the beginning of my book is I'm approaching this as an anthropologist would. Just as a little bit aside before I carry on with these points. I'm a social anthropologist. I'm actually a biological anthropologist as well. I do anthropology, but in this case, I'm doing social anthropology. And what a social you're in the field. You're in some tribe. You're hearing some shaman. He seems to be the person that's pretty influential. He's singing songs and coming up with mantras and phrases and stuff. And as an anthropologist coming from a different culture, you might just think this is nonsense. Bad mistake. Don't just. You're a very bad anthropologist if you just say this is all nonsense. You've got to understand why that particular, what seems to you nonsense, seems in this particular culture to be so deep, so moving, so powerful, so intense. You've got to work out the history of that culture, who this person is, what their needs are, where their emotions have got to fathom why what seems to you nonsense to these people is deeply meaningful stuff. So, when I first began to work on, I wrote my book, Blood Relations. I was very happy with it, great book, a lot of you read it, but it had a huge hole in it. It didn't get to language. It covered symbolic culture, kinship, religion, all that stuff. It left out the main thing. My book left out the most important thing, language. Why did I leave it out? Well, because as soon as I looked at language, I started reading Noam Chomsky, the world's expert on language, and I couldn't make head or tail. I just thought, this is completely baffling me. I'm fairly modest on occasion. I just thought to myself, I don't understand Einstein too well. I'm not a mathematician. So it's probably my fault. If I don't understand it, I've got to do some learning. I've got to work at it really hard. Because this stuff is genius. Everybody says Chomsky's a genius. Everybody says he's invented modern linguistics. I've got to get my head around it. It took me 20 years. But what I immediately worked out was that although I loved his politics, his linguistics was so baffling that what I needed to do was work out the tribe in which it was incubated. I had to think, right, what was the time, the place, the institutional, political circumstances in which this, what seems to be nonsense, took root. And the tribe I needed to investigate, it really was a tribe. It was the US war science community immediately after World War II. In other words, it was the inhabitants of a large number of Pentagon labs and think tanks who, just having defeated the Nazis, were beginning to turn all their attention to communism, world communism as they called it, the great enemy. And they were drunk with power, actually, in that period. They defeated the Nazis. Europe was in ruins. China wasn't anywhere at that time, of course. Neither was Japan. They invented the nuclear bomb and dropped a couple of them. And now they were dreaming of using their computers as extraordinary, like omnipotent command and control instruments for eavesdropping on the world's communications, for monitoring what was happening everywhere in the world, and above all, for guiding their thermonuclear weapons and other weapons to hit exactly the targets. That was the tribe I needed to investigate. And so I started looking at the tribe. This book's about that particular tribe. I mean, you don't have to call it a tribe if you like, but what I'm trying to argue is that as soon as you do look at that period, you realise why the military in that period needed somebody like Noam Chomsky to solve a number of their problems. I should stress, as I do at the very outset, nothing that Noam produced was of the slightest use militarily to the Pentagon. None of the language modules, designs that he came up with, were remotely workable. And as I say in my book, I don't think Noam ever wanted them to be workable because he had too strong a conscience. He wanted to have a job, a very good job, a very inspiring job, a huge amount of prestige and pleasure in his work, but he drew a line. He drew a line between theory and practice. He wasn't going to roll up his sleeves and produce something which could, as he puts it, maim, kill and destroy. So there's a reason why his models of this command and control system, this machine translation machine which he was employed to produce, there's a reason why it never worked. I don't think he sabotaged it. To be honest, I think the whole thing was unworkable anyway, even though very inspiring, but he wasn't interested in actually killing people. Quite the opposite. He had enough of a very powerful anti-militarist conscience to go nowhere near the transition from software to hardware, if you like. But what I need to stress, and this is the essence of the book, is why it was that it became respectable throughout the West to isolate theory from practice in this so deep and powerful a way that everybody was affected, and actually Marxists probably were more affected than most people. As I'm sure you're aware, all the sort of various forms of Western Marxism, they're all mentalists in the sense I've just discussed. This idea of mind over matter, software being more important than hardware, turned Karl Marx upside down. Marx, of course, had the view that to understand what goes on in the mind, you need first to understand what happens in the body. You have to know about eating, producing, reproduction, cooperation, the relationship, the means of production and the relations of production, to then work out how those impact upon consciousness, upon what's in the head. The cognitive revolution turned that on its head. And as I've outlined in this book quite clearly, the supporters of the cognitive revolution, all of whom acknowledge Noam Chomsky as their ancestor, their founder really, they describe what they did as the triumph of mind over matter. In fact, they go further. They say what we did with the cognitive revolution was we abolished matter. Forget about matter. You can't study matter. You can only study mind. Chomsky, by the way, is very clear about that. He says you can't study matter, it's too complicated. But you can study mind, because it's nice and crisp and clear like software. And that's, and you can be scientific about it. Now, what I'm arguing, I'm going to come back to my little list of strange dogmas in a second. What I'm arguing is, I want you to put yourself in his place. Put yourself in Noam Chomsky's place. You've been not quite pacifist, but pretty strongly opposed to killing people since a teenager. I mean, when Noam Chomsky was a teenager and he heard about Hiroshima, he went very quiet. Everyone around him was saying, great, we managed to, get the Japs. And Chomsky was on a summer school in the forest somewhere. And he said he just couldn't talk to anybody. He went so quiet, he was so shocked. He had just had to wander around all on his own in a kind of mourning. So he always felt a massive, much more than just suspicion or misgivings about nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, but a deep instinctive hostility, which he kept to the end of his life. So imagine Noam Chomsky with coming to the world's #1 weapons lab, huge laboratory making weapons of mass destruction. How do you cope? And now I'll go a little bit further. I've documented in the book how, first of all, in chapter 4, the most hideous institution on this earth, he actually, when the students in his own campus were beginning to rise up and demand the closing down of his own lab and many other labs, Chomsky wrote a letter to the New York Review of Books saying, I'm thinking of resigning because my institution, MIT, is up to its neck in crime. So he sent this letter. Actually, he wrote it to a friend who then published it. He didn't really want it to be published, but it went all over the place once it was published. Noam Chomsky is resigning in shame and disgust at what his institution's up to. He went very quiet, and then I don't know what happened. Nobody knows quite what happened, but all we know is that a month later, he wrote another letter. And he said, that letter I wrote a month ago is quite unfair. MIT as an institution doesn't produce weapons of mass destruction. Yes, individuals may be working on weapons of mass destruction, but as an institution, MIT is honourable, it's a libertarian institution, and he justified absolute academic freedom to produce anything you like as long as you don't use that stuff. So that was early on. So he decided to stay, having sort of solved in his own head the dilemma by saying that some individuals in his electronics lab might be producing weapons, but he wasn't, and anyway the institution as a whole wasn't interested in producing weapons. They're complete. He had to. I can understand why he had to believe that, because I suppose he would have had nightmares. He would have felt he had to resign. But everybody knows that the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was the main research laboratory for weapons of mass destruction. To say it was just individuals is completely ridiculous, but I can understand why it's nice having a job, especially a really good job. You don't want to give it up. And something must have happened between those two letters to make him retract the first letter. I presume his dean, his principal, said, Noam, you're out on your neck unless you retract. So he retracted. I assume that. I've got no proof. Maybe some other reason that he's had the same July million. Anyway, I've also documented in the book how, at a later stage, he was interviewed about one of his best friends. Perhaps that's too strong. One of his friends, a really good friend, however. This friend was later the director of the CIA, John Deutsch is his name. And again, I've got it in chapter and verse. Trump's perfectly open about it. He says, yes, we were good friends, we chatted, we got on well with each other. He and I disagreed about possibly everything you could disagree about in terms of politics, but he was honest, we knew where we stood with him, and he says, I actually voted for him to be, there was some elections to elect the principal of his college, and most of his friends said, you can't vote for that. It's John Deutsch, so you knew what he was up to. He was, by the way, the inventor, one of the inventors of what are called daisy cutters, fuel air explosives. You drop them about half a mile above the ground, and they're brilliant things because they kill all living stuff, but they leave the equipment intact. Daisy cutters. So he invented this stuff. Anyway, Noam Chomsky was friends with this guy. So when I found that out, and it's not secret, it's just you have to put two together, I just thought, right, okay, I'm in the evening denouncing the CIA to my anarchist friends and saying, these bastards, their hands are dripping in blood. You're talking about the massacre in Indonesia, 4 million peasants, this, that, and that. Meanwhile, that's in the evening, I go to sleep, get up in the morning, go to work, and at lunchtime I'm having a meal with my friend John Deutsch, the future director of the CIA. How do I cope? And I just thought to myself, right, if it was me and I found a way of doing this, I would certainly not want, when I go to my anarchist meeting denouncing the CIA, I would not want my CIA friend there in the room with me. That would make not a lot of sense if you kinds of trouble. But likewise, if I'm having lunch with my CIA friend, my would-be future CIA friend, he wasn't quite director of the CIA at the time, he was a friend, but he still said he's a great guy, which was honourable and all that stuff. I wouldn't, when I'm having my chats with this John Deutsch, I don't think I'd want my anarchist mates at the table with me. it would just cause all kinds of unpleasant emotional ruptures. So what do? I keep this audience over here. These are the military people, or the boffins, who are producing weapons of mass destruction. I keep the anarchist lot over here. And I'd probably be tempted to sort of alter the language I use over here, compare with the language I use over there, and probably do my best to make kind of a bit of a firewall between this work I do and this work I do, until kind of unconsciously and imperceptibly the two camps are just not on speaking terms. The activists can't understand a word of what the boffins are up to. The boffins can't understand a word, probably don't want to understand a word of what the activists are up to. And so you've got these two constituencies, and you are one person, of course. I'm thinking of myself, Noam Chomsky, but I've really got to split my brain in two. I've got to speak this language to this lot, completely different language to this lot, and there's got to be an absolute firewall between the two. And this is my theory with the military, this is my practice with the anarchists and activists, and between the theory and the practice, there's got to be no communication. What I'm arguing is that that way of dealing with things, because Chomsky was so highly respected, no one could fault his moral integrity, his standing as an anti-war activist, and no one could fault his standing as a scientist. Because of his integrity, because he wasn't an obviously military person, he enabled the military to package their cognitive revolution in ways which were politically correct, politically acceptable, but it made it also politically acceptable for all of us, really. I say all of us. I suppose I was particularly thinking of people who have got jobs in media, intellectuals, academics. We can all kind of work, or perhaps even further, perhaps even deeper, perhaps almost anywhere. We're working for a bank or something, we're working for a harness manufacturer. We all have to work for a living. The work often isn't all that morally unsavoury. I mean, the work we do is mostly for some wretch, some corporate employer. Probably we're destroying a part of the planet and doing the work we're doing. We're certainly going to be screwing other people. So we're doing pretty shady work, pretty much all of us. But we have to hold our heads high. We have to be able to hold our heads high and think of ourselves as doing a good job, and in a way doing a good job within that context. But above all, there's now a separation between what we do as professionals and what we might do in a different capacity, and the two mustn't connect with each other. So, I've been told, in fact, as you probably know, I got sacked from my university for making a bit of a connection between my anthropology, which is all about the human revolution, and my activism, which is all about the human revolution. And my management told me it was gross professional misconduct. So to connect your academic work with your activism in a direct way, thank you, is itself unprofessional. So what I'm arguing is that Noam Chomsky made it respectable for everybody to do this, to separate the academic and intellectual work you do from your activism as far as possible. And I'm saying that although that's a contradiction which, in a way, all of us have to face, Noam faced that contradiction with more intensity than anyone else I can think of. I mean, to be actually the world's number one critic of the US military while working as probably one of the number one scientists, certainly in terms of the link between natural science and human science, absolutely number one in electronics, one of the most celebrated figures. How do you square those two sides of your work? And it seems to me that the strangeness of his linguistics, and in another sense the strangeness of his activism, can be explained once we see that need to separate the two things. So what's going on, this is where I left off in this long digression. How do you make you're Noam Chomsky and you're doing linguistics. How do you make that linguistics utterly irrelevant politically? I know you define language in a new way. You define it as not only not political, but not even social. Language emerged in the human species so that one human could talk to, as he puts it, itself. So you have to make your linguistics, your science, purely natural science. You have to remove every last trace of social science, anthropology, social psychology from your linguistics, so that it's purely natural science on the grounds that, like mathematics, natural science has got no political significance. So what I'm arguing is very, very simple. I'm saying that the strange features of language, as Chomsky conceives it, are just a logical consequence of removing politics from your linguistics. So as another example, I'm getting back to my examples now. Words. Take words. How do words emerge? We actually know quite a lot about how words emerge nowadays. Mostly the initial form of the word is kind of iconic. There's some link between the sound of the word or the shape of the word and what it means. And after a while, as it gets conventionalized, that link, as we develop shorthand, the link begins to disappear a bit. But certainly words are coined by people who originally produce some kind of metaphor, which seem to be quite clever and appropriate. Somebody else gets the metaphor. In other words, you're saying something that isn't quite true, but they get what you mean by it. And after a while, the metaphor gets a bit tired and familiar. Then it becomes a dead metaphor. It can then become a grammatical suffix or prefix, grammatical marker. But the key point is that words are cultural, historical products emerging out of social interaction. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. Okay. What's Chomsky got? He's got a problem now. He's got to say that words are natural. Words don't emerge out of social interaction. That would be, if it's social, it's political. So you've got to get rid of that. How do you then make a claim that words are as natural as grammar, in the sense that it's all the grammar, according to Chomsky, is natural. It's installed in the brain at birth. All the different words are installed genetically in the brain. How do you make words installed in the brain at birth? Well, it's easy. Just say, there you are. I said it. Words are installed in the brain at birth. So the philosopher Hilary Putnam said, no, are you really saying that words are installed in the brain at birth? Yes, says no. What, you mean book? You mean in the Stone Age, before people had books, they had the word book in their heads? Yep, says no. They had the word book. Oh, that's interesting. So Hilary Putnam thought, I'm going to have to explore this a bit further. He said, all right, what about bureaucrat? Yep. I mean, you didn't have bureaucrats, obviously, before writing. So how can hunter-gatherers have the concept of a bureaucrat? No, he says, the chapter and verse in my book, you might find it difficult to believe. I have to say that Noam Chomsky's supporters, I go to the anarchist book fair each year, and I get jumped on by these anarchist supporters. They say, Chris and I, you don't know a damn thing. Noam Chomsky just says grammar is genetically installed. It doesn't say words are genetically installed. I have to read them out, all this stuff. Because Hilary Putnam then said, he was scratching his head, how do I... All right, carburettor. Surely you're not saying carburettor is an innate concept which is installed in the brain of Homo sapiens at the moment of speciation 100,000 years ago. You'd have thought he would have given up at that point, wouldn't you? Afraid not. No one says, no, carburettor is an innate concept. It has to be innate because children learn words so quickly that if they didn't know the meaning... No, he doesn't say the sound is innate. He says what's called lexical concept, the concept of a carburettor. True, he says the child has to work out in which particular area it is, what the sound corresponding to that concept is concerned. But actually, Chomsky's not interested in sounds anyway, because you're just talking to yourself, you don't need sounds. So the lexical concept, this conceptual side of the word carburettor is installed at birth. Now, I've said all this, in a way, expecting the reaction I've got from you. You're all laughing. Dan Dennett just said that. He said, when we hear this stuff, we just can't help our sides are splitting with laughter. Daniel Dennett said, also Aristotle had the concept of a bicycle. They didn't invent bicycles yet. And then Dan Dennett goes on about, what about jumbo jets? And what about wide-bodied jumbo jets? And what about Apex Return Boston cheap fare, whatever it is? And he just goes on until the whole room of Dan Dennett were just, side splitting in laughter. But I don't want to just do that. That's kind of cheap and it's been done already. I'm interested in that. Why would the world's dominant linguist need to say such strange, I mean they are strange, at the very least strange things? And I'm saying because the point about language is that it's where nature meets culture. If you're interested in language, you're interested in that part of our biology which moves over into the social. To understand, for example, how language originated in a species, you've really got to put the big picture together. You've got to link up the earth sciences, geology, all the history of climate change through the Pleistocene period. Think about, monkeys, apes, chimpanzees, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, getting to hunter-gatherers. You've got to join the arts and humanities and social sciences with the natural sciences in order to work out how it is that we humans came to evolve language, to possess language. And what I'm saying is that Noam Chomsky was forced by his job to separate out the two domains, to put language into the natural sciences totally at the expense of anything social or political. So towards the end of my book, I deal with the origin of language. Now I'm actually, as Noam knows, I've met Noam, he's met lots of occasions, a few occasions. He came to one of my conferences I organised in Boston in 2002. He only agreed to participate in the conference if he could sort of parachute in on the last day and give a huge, a lecture to a huge crowd of people and wouldn't really actually involve himself in debates. So I know him. I was another occasion in Stony Brook where I did engage in a debate with him, and he didn't like it. He walked off the stage, and because I was just saying, no, are you really saying that language is for talking to yourself? And he didn't like that. But anyway, so I'm over the last 20 years since I've published Blood Relations, I've been working with a group called EVOLang. It's the Evolution of Language International Series of Conferences. In fact, I co-founded EVOLang with my friend Jim Herford back in 1996. So we are the people I just knew that the origin of language wasn't, you couldn't just invent a theory. You'd need, like the world scientific community, those who are interested in, to work on this hugely challenging, difficult problem. And over the years, I think we've got somewhere. I think we now roughly know how language evolved in our species. And there's still some disagreements, but I think we've basically cracked it. That'd be my next book, but I've already published lots of edited volumes on this subject. How does Noam Chomsky deal with it? First of all, he didn't. He just refused. He just said language is there. It didn't evolve. But then with my conferences, and him having to come to some of those conferences and having to have an answer, his friends were saying, no, I mean, you can't just say language is just there. You're going to have a theory. How did it get there? But then, of course, in order to avoid it being political, because the science can't be political because his activism is political, he had to come up with the most non-political, neutral, if you like, irrelevant theory you could possibly have. I mean, imagine you're just thinking, how do I make the origin of language? And from my point of view, how do we make this revolution, the human revolution, the point where Darwinian evolution culminates in a massive social and political revolution? How do you make that event utterly meaningless? That's your task. Oh, I know. What about, and this is a story, what about you had an ape man, call him Prometheus, just to give him a name in one of the versions, and he was wandering around and there was a cosmic ray show. Perhaps some supernova had exploded in some distant galaxy, and these cosmic rays bombarded the brain of this ape man, and it installed inside the brain a language organ. Not just any old language organ, but a perfect language organ. Fully formed in an instant, whereupon this ape began talking to itself. That's his theory. He actually says for tens of thousands of years after language emerged in the species, individuals had language, but they didn't know that each other had language, because each one was talking to itself. And eventually they may have found, it seems to, because he admits that nowadays we do talk to ourselves, eventually they seem to have worked out some way of using the language to communicate with each other. What he says is that language is surprisingly imperfect. What he means by that is that language, with language I'm sure all of you know this. I looked again at that rather bad film, actually, the film on Alan Turing, The Imitation Game, where it makes out that Alan Turing was autistic. And so anyway, Alan Turing as a child, as a teenager, he's saying, I need a code book. I need all these codes. Because wherever I go, people are saying things, and they never say what they mean. And I've got to interpret it. How do you do it? And he's looking at his code book to find out. And it's true that humans, we're not robots and we're not computers. We say one thing. It's not that we're lying. We're not saying one thing and meaning another in the sense we're sort of perfidious. We say one thing because we expect the audience to be a little bit imaginative in interpreting the metaphors and other figures of speech which we're using. So we need a certain trusting audience to hear what we're saying. Now that's the reality, that language depends on a certain amount of goodwill, cooperation and trust. But for Chomsky, the ambiguity of language is one of its major defects. It stops it being perfect. And then he says a lot of other things. He says the phonology is a mass of bad features, imperfections. The fact that we've got more than one language in the world is an imperfection. If language was perfect, everybody would speak exactly the same language, although each one would talk to himself, of course, or herself, and there wouldn't be all these ambiguities about what people are saying. And as soon as you think about it, you realise, right, what does he mean by a perfect language? He means the kind of language which computer boffins use. A large part of my book goes back to the idea of the Tower of Babel and the language machine idea, because what happened in America in the 50s, in fact during the war, was Warren Weaver, a great big sort of fixer. He had the idea of a new Tower of Babel. In other words, constructing a machine which would make all the world's languages one by automatically being able to translate between one and the other. And what's absolutely clear is that when Chomsky says, I'm not interested in computers, I'm only interested in language. The computer metaphor of the mind, the idea that the mind is a digital computer, was so heavily internalized, thanks to Noam Chomsky and his mates, that when Chomsky says, I'm not interested in computers, he's got a point. He's interested in the computer, actually modelled on other digital computers, but much more sophisticated, which he assumes to be inserted inside the human mind. And that would be perfect. The fact that languages are different is a mass of imperfections. But he says that deep down, when language was installed, it was perfect. And at some deep level, he says perfect as a crystal or as a snowflake. I've got only, how many?
I've taken the 1
okay,
off.
Okay, we take the 10 off, and all I've got is 0. Okay,
minutes.
fine. Okay, so anyway, I mean, the take-home message is that Chomsky has validated the idea that activism is best conducted without any reference to science, and that scientists need to do their work completely autonomously in their labs and stuff without worrying about any political implications. Whereas I'm arguing, as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did, of course, that nothing is more revolutionary than science, and that to be revolutionaries, we have to be scientists in the best sense of the term. Science is a collective endeavour. You don't just make statements, you're not just a guru, you all check each other's findings. Do you see what I see? It's a huge collective endeavour. Probably the most well, it's exactly revolutionary, but the part of science which has got the most urgent political implications these days is climate science. I mean, climate scientists around the world, if you put together what they're saying, they're pretty much saying rather urgently, get moving, or there won't be a planet that's habitable in 100 or 200 years' time. And borders, by the way, are getting really in the way. We've got one planet, it's a living planet, we need to look after it. That's a very urgent message coming from science. But I'm interested in putting all the different sciences together, as they should be. As Marx said, in the end there will be one science, not a whole bunch of different sciences. And I think this is the moment to start doing exactly that. And there's no better place to announce this project than in the summer school of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Communism lives! Very good and very interesting question, which deserves a proper answer. I devote quite a lot of the book to the positive sides of Noam Chomsky. I try to be really fair and balanced. I'm not going to denounce the idea of a language instinct. I think it's actually a very good idea. And this is answering John's point. So, for example, if you take a chimpanzee and rear it in your family, you can, with some effort, teach it something remotely like, not all that much like, but remotely like American Sign Language. And if it's a bonobo, like a very famous bonobo called Kanzi, that's a type of chimpanzee, it ended up with a very large vocabulary, and you could say go to the fridge, take the orange juice out, put the orange juice on the hat, put the hat on the orange juice, and it will do all those things. But it somehow finds it really difficult, pretty much impossible, to get grammar. A grammar of any language is just about the most complex theoretical construct any human will ever master, probably more difficult than a lot of mathematical theories. And yet, as I think John was saying, a child will pick it up and it will master this incredibly complex theoretical structure by its own efforts, with a certain amount of interaction with peers, of course, and more will come out than goes in. It will come out with more inventive and creative sentences than ever went into that child, and you do not have to teach it. And so Chomsky liberated us from one of the most horrendously totalitarian philosophical paradigms ever, largely invented in the Soviet Union with that horrible person called Pavlov who kept on cutting off dogs' heads to put extra heads on its backside, and the most weird and wonderful things with experiments which I found extremely disgusting and of no scientific interest at all, because so what you can put a head on the back of a dog and make it do various natural things. It doesn't tell you anything about dogs, or other animals. So, and then of course B.F. Skinner in the States actually thought of himself as a left-winger, to be fair to this guy Skinner, but he had this idea of a perfect society, which would be like regulated by reward and punishment. So that his idea of socialism was that the manager would somehow push the right buttons in people and give them rewards for behaving well and lock them up for behaving badly, or perhaps give them a bit of electric shock, and then you'd have the perfect society. And of course Noam Chomsky he said, well, you've got concentration camps that are organised like that, and Noam didn't want to be anything to do with organising concentration camps. And Noam Chomsky described behaviourism, that whole model, as a massive scientific fraud which just justified certain people who wanted to be managers or maybe concentration camp guards, make them feel that what they're doing is science. So they're dressing up kind of fraudulent theory as science. So I mean, there's no question that what you're saying about universal grammar and what you're saying, John, about the kid, picking up Bulgarian, these are all parts of the reason why Noam Chomsky was felt to be an extraordinary breath of fresh air, a wonderful liberation from this horrible blank slate theory of the human mind, which, by the way, all too often is not just associated with Marxism, but all too often Marxists, people who call themselves Marxists, for example, the whole of the SWP, they actually have the bloody blank slate theory of human culture and nature. They don't believe in any kind of innate cognitive architecture. They denounce anything genetic as somehow racist and sexist and all that stuff. And too many Marxists go along with that stuff, because for some reason the idea is that when Marxist conditions determine consciousness, that means that the mind is malleable, a blank slate, and you can imprint any kind of pattern you like on it, which is complete nonsense, and nothing like anything Karl Marx said. So yes, there's a huge side of the Chomsky stuff was a liberation. On English, in other words, on the idea that Noam was responsible for the idea that you don't have certain superior languages like Latin, or more recently English, and meanwhile African languages are somehow more primitive. I think it's not quite accurate to say that Noam Chomsky was the author of that idea. It was actually Franz Boas and many linguists in a much earlier period who made it really a basic assumption of all linguists that all languages are equally complex. And if anything, Noam Chomsky's effect was somewhat, in my view, and the view of many others, to reverse that. Because what Noam Chomsky said is, he said, you don't need to go in the field. You don't need to do like field work in Native American languages, Aboriginal Australian languages. He actually went pretty close to saying, I've got some quotes in my book, to saying all languages are the same, and if you want to know universal grammar, you might as well study English, because English is just as good an example of universal grammar as any other. He says, I only study English, I only know one language, and I don't need to know all these other languages, because English is as good as, he said, I'm a native speaker of English, and therefore this gives me a special access through my intuitions as a native English speaker to universal grammar. And he said, of course, I might reach conclusions which would then be necessary to check out some other languages, but to a large extent, the type of linguistics that Noam Chomsky was responsible for was felt to be legitimizing the American temptation to go around the world exporting English around the world and not really learning other languages on the grounds that we all speak the same language and it might as well be English. I'm sorry to have to say that, but that was a very big effect, and most of the people who studied other languages, particularly Aboriginal Australian and African languages, were furious with Noam Chomsky because the assumptions he made about universal grammar based on English were just wrong. Again and again and again and again and again, some language in Australia or somewhere was unearthed, which completely violated all the predictions that Noam Chomsky made about universal grammar. Mark's point about Walt Rostow, it was actually Mark that told me about this, and luckily I had just about enough time to quickly put it in my book. So thanks, Mark. But I mean, it's a very important point that I don't necessarily think, and possibly this will answer your point, Anne, as well. When you say maybe Noam's problem is his anarchism, to me, saying it stems from his anarchism is kind of cart before the horse. I want to do the opposite. I want to explain the particular thing which Noam calls anarchism, what his friends call anarchism. I want a proper sociological explanation for that particular variant, if you like, of anarchism. Okay. Rather than say anarchism is the cause of all this stuff, because that can't be a Marxist approach, really. So I don't think he does what he likes because he's an anarchist. I think he did what he sort of had to do because of the particular fix he found himself in with that particular job. And it needs to be said, another point which Mark put me onto was that in the States immediately after World War II, one of the things which Noam said was that at a place like Harvard, you could cut the anti-Semitism with a knife. There was a huge amount of anti-Semitic prejudice, which meant that people who'd escaped from the gas chambers in Europe, like Roman Jakobson, for example, but others like Noam, an Ashkenazi Jew who escaped from Tsarist Russia from the pogrom a lot earlier, they actually found it very difficult to get jobs because there was this snootiness and snobbishness and particular anti-Semitism. So a place like MIT, which is almost like a technical college, would kind of take anybody, as it were. And Noam got a job at this weapons of mass destruction laboratory because you needed a job. So what I'm saying is that the version of anarchism that emerged was a product of circumstances rather than, you can't use it to explain those circumstances. And anyway, I don't think he was doing what he liked. I think he was given a particular privilege because linguistics had to be completely reinvented for US military purposes. I've gone into my book in some paper. But anyway, about Rostow, it's true that, does everyone get the point here? Mark, this Rostow guy was the architect of some of the worst crimes perpetrated against the Vietnamese people, who wanted his job back at MIT. Noam Chomsky called him a criminal, a war criminal, as did all his friends. But Noam said, yes, he's a war criminal, but this is an academic institution where we have freedom of speech and expression. And he vehemently opposed the students who wanted to stop Rostow getting his job back. And he actually wrote a letter to the management threatening disruptive action if Rostow wasn't allowed his job back. Can you believe it? In fact, the management were too sensible and they realised it would cause riots if Rostow was allowed his job back, and they'd already had a bit of a riot when Rostow turned up just to give one lecture. So Noam Chomsky's, if by Noam Chomsky's anarchism you mean his extreme commitment to freedom of speech and expression, absolute extreme commitment to lack of censorship, that was just the management speak. The management line was just like, anyone can work out all kinds of methods of torturing people and bombing them and I don't know, whatever. You can spend a whole life on new and ingenious ways of killing millions of civilians. But as long as you're working in your lab doing that and not doing the actual killing, you have every right to do it. So that distinction between theory and practice was central for reasons I've explained. And of course it led to the possibly, again, Mark has helped explain this for me, the thing which anti-Chomsky, Zionist, pro-Israel people most throw at him is when he wrote the preface to a book written by a Holocaust denier called Forisson. And Noam Chomsky, everyone in France was saying this thing should be not published, he shouldn't be allowed a job. As an academic, he's a Holocaust denier. And Noam Chomsky rushed to his defense and even wrote an article which was then incorporated as a preface to this book. Of course it doesn't mean that Chomsky was sympathetic to Holocaust denial. He was just extrapolating. He was extending the principle that he'd applied to Rostow and others at his own campus to this guy, a Holocaust denier. But what I'm saying is Chomsky had to feel himself free to work on models of command and control, models of a language machine in a laboratory, like in the abstract, without anyone saying it was immoral, because Chomsky needed to be able to say, I'm just working on the theory, and so that management principle that anything goes in the university, as long as you can make a distinction between theory and practice, that was Chomsky's, in a way, his anarchism. I mean, as probably most of you know, his actual theoretical commitments after Adam Smith and people like that. He's a liberal, not at all a Marxist. Now and again he expresses some sympathy with Marx. But the particular kind of anarchism, that extreme freedom of speech anarchism that he's known for, is just a basic management principle of all the world's universities. And you can see why they uphold that principle, because they want to be able to get money for defence contracts, and they wouldn't be able to do it if the students were allowed to disrupt people from doing weapons of mass destruction research in those universities. The management need to uphold it, and I don't see any difference between Chomsky's freedom of speech and management speech, freedom of speech. Is that everything?
Yeah.
Have I answered everybody? Oh, Stan. Where's Stan? Oh, yeah. Yeah. About society, socially. You know, possibly the most famous statement ever made by a certain Margaret Thatcher: there is no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. In a way, Noam Chomsky invented that. I mean, Noam Chomsky's I language idea, and the basic idea of the cognitive revolution, that the individual has packed in its head everything that makes us human. Long before Thatcher came along, economists were coming up with this stuff, as were linguists, and it was part of a mainstream individualistic ideology, which Noam Chomsky, in his linguistic capacity, in his scientific capacity, came up with. And when Thatcher came out with it, she was just parroting the conventional wisdom. So no such thing as society, therefore no such thing as social science. And a thing I stress in the book, but didn't stress in my talk, because you have to make choices when you're giving a talk, is that just as Noam Chomsky gets rid of all social dimensions from his linguistics, he gets rid of all scientific dimensions from his activism in politics. So his books on Israel and Palestine and all that stuff, they're good books, but have you noticed something? It's true that he has footnotes. He will cite the newspaper article he's got the information from, or the government report he's got the information from. But there's no science in those articles. He doesn't use any kind of economic science, climate science. He doesn't refer, and it's not me that says that. He himself says you don't need science to see the truth. You just need an ordinary common sense to see this is evil, and you just need to be aware that people lie, and therefore you need to sort of see through those lies. He says science is in a completely different compartment, and it just passes us by. The science and activism just pass one another by. Neither has got anything to say to the other. He says that. And if you don't believe me, read my book. He's very emphatic about that. Science has got no political significance, and you certainly shouldn't base your activism on science. Maybe you can be aware of the science.
Can I just describe what you mean by that? So
Sorry?
He has a great reliance on using factual information.
Yeah.
And you say that's not science.
No, I say it is science. I don't think science is anything special. I think science is we check each other out. Do you see what I see? I'm saying something about the Americans in Iraq. To me, if it's true, it's kind of science. But I'm saying Chomsky puts science in a special compartment of kind of gobbledygook. Science is incomprehensible, very, very difficult, very technical. You need a special kind of brain to have it, and he calls it a science forming module. He's the one that puts science into this strange box somewhere else. He's one of the people responsible for making activists feel that science is none of their business. It's a terrible consequence of one of the main things that Noam Chomsky did with that cognitive revolution, was to wrap up science as a kind of gobbledygook. And of course it suited the corporations to do that as well. I mean, and states, they don't particularly want activists to be scientifically aware of stuff going on in the world. And I'm afraid, despite his maybe best intentions, Noam Chomsky has to bear a heavy responsibility for separating science out as something special in a separate box, which I don't think it should be.
So in spite of all the things you've said, you claim that you have great respect for this man. You essentially illustrated as not understanding almost anything of what you write.
Can I?
Well, I think it's a very fair point. No, it's not that. As I say, I love Noam Chomsky, and what he says politically, I think is great. No.
Essentially illustrated as some kind of buffoon.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't think he's a buffoon.
No.
But I mean, do you think that carburetor is an innate concept? And do you think language is for talking to yourself?
I don't think he says any of those things.
Oh, right. Well,
Okay.
then we have a problem.
I'm going to let you, yeah,
I
I'm going to let
I just have
you
to
indicate and come back because I've got other people
I
to
mean,
speak.
you have to read the book, or read something.
I'd rather read the source material.
Well, that's right, but the source material is quoted here, and I've got all the references you could possibly need. And I'm not calling him a buffoon at all. The question I want to answer first is about Plato, because you're absolutely right. Plato has the idea of the soul being different from the body, and thanks to reincarnation, every soul already knows a whole lot of stuff and doesn't have to learn it. And Chomsky explicitly says that's a better theory than the blank slate theory of Skinner. And maybe it is a better theory, because I mean, I think that, that in a way we do have a kind of soul in the sense that we're different from other animals. We're self-aware. And also, I think it's absolutely true that language is part of human nature, that every child comes into the world sort of knowing what a language is, and that explains how that child is so able to, to master this complex theoretical structure, which is the grammar of a language. But Noam is explicitly a supporter of Plato's doctrine of the soul and Descartes' doctrine of the soul. And he says that. He says, I think we need to bring the concept of the soul up to date. And so Chomsky says, so therefore, instead of talking about reincarnation of the soul, I'm going to talk about genetics, because we're all born with the knowledge that previous generations have had, and it's the genes which transport from our ancestors down to where we are. And so he said, I'm updating the doctrine of the soul, and I've gone a little bit further and shown how actually pretty much everything that Chomsky says about language, if you think of it as the soul, you're there. For example, Chomsky says language can't evolve. He says you can't have a little bit of language in a child and then it gets more complex. So if you're talking about human evolution, there must have been a moment when Homo sapiens or some ancestor went from no language to language. And it's true in the sense that it's very hard if I was brought up a Catholic, so I know about this. It's very hard to think of a quarter of a soul or three quarters of a soul or something which is nearly a soul. To be honest, you've either got the soul or you haven't. And so if you think of it as the soul, then as a child's acquiring language, it's going to have, if you say that the fetus has got no soul, and I mean Catholics, I'm not sure quite what the position is these days, but I think the idea is it doesn't exactly have a soul, even though it's wrong to have an abortion. But anyway, the thing is that you're going to have to go from no soul to a perfect soul, because the soul is that kind of thing. And indeed, what Noam Chomsky says is that language acquisition occurs at an instant. So lots of child psychologists who've observed children, they've seen that first it goes to the babbling stage, then it has a one-word stage, and it has a few more words. And Chomsky says all this is irrelevant, because the crucial thing is that the child has language, and we might as well regard it as instantaneous. And it's a better scientific theory to say that the child goes from no language to full language, perfect language. And also it's more scientific to say in the course of evolution, you can forget Darwin, because Homo in the course of evolution went from zero language to not just full language, but perfect language, albeit it was inside. Now again, the soul fits that, because do you talk with your soul? Do you share your soul? You might talk language, but your soul is in you, isn't it? If you believe in the soul, it's somewhere deep inside you. So I'm just saying that there are reasons why patriarchal religions make this soul-body distinction, and there are reasons why the idea of the soul is uplifting and inspiring. It makes us different, and I think there are reasons why all of us kind of sort of wish that science was something which could lift us up a bit, and which talked about eternal truths and wasn't all fuzzy and messy, and we had to keep on repairing the theories. And I do think that actually, possibly especially people on the left, who we feel, our gods have gone, maybe, up to me, Marx is still up there, Engels is still up there, to a point Trotsky is still up there, but I mean, we sort of need to be lifted up, and I just think my own view is that a thing called science, which is like eternal and pure and unsullied, is kind of inspiring. But I do think it fulfills the function which Plato's doctrine of the soul performed and Descartes' doctrine of the soul performed. It lifts you up, but it's not science. I think Chomsky's stuff is I mean, there are different words you can use. One word is scientism, which is the aesthetics of science, the feel that it's science, the idea that science is somehow above humans and is objective and all that stuff. And I think, to be honest, I think Chomsky being quite wise in many ways to say, don't worry about the details, this is science. Because then lots of anarchists are going to, we all need this security, this idea that in a world of upheavals and uncertainties and crisis, if there's at least a pole star somewhere, something's constant, it kind of keeps us going. And the doctrine of the soul is one of those things, but really we're dealing with religion and not science. On the wild children, the isolated babies and stuff, there are in fact documented cases. The most famous is a girl called Jeannie, who was found at the age of 12. Her abusive father had locked her up all life, and she never got grammar. And the idea is that you need, if you're going to acquire the grammar of a language, you need to get going about the age of 1, 2, 3. And if you miss out at what's called the critical period of language acquisition, you're never going to learn it any more than an adult can learn the accent of a new language. You can learn whatever new language as an adult, but you'll never get it right. You'll always seem like a foreigner. Doesn't matter how hard you try. So Chomsky absolutely would agree that a child would need a loving environment in order, and it would need to be not damaged emotionally in order to acquire language. But he doesn't call that learning. He says the child doesn't need to learn language because the critical period for language acquisition is rather like puberty. It's something that happens to you at a certain age. And so at the critical period of age 2 or 3, the child's biology, the biology of the brain, will sort of soak up from its surroundings. As long as it's got like normal surroundings, loving surroundings, it will soak up. It kind of knows language already. But the point I'm making is that if you're okay, and I'm going to come to you. I know you spoke earlier on and not in this last session, but about Chomsky being a buffoon. I think that's a wrong way of approaching Noam Chomsky, and it wouldn't get you anywhere. And I think I've tried very hard not to do that. But I agree when I'm talking about carburettor. That's the thing which other philosophers have made a joke about. They can't help laughing about it. And so
you mentioned you disagree with. What do you agree with? Because
I said humans are going. I agree with him. I'm one of the Marxists that, unlike most Marxists, I believe in genetics. I'm a Darwinian. And I believe that we have a language instinct. I think every child is born with the equipment, the biological equipment, to acquire a language. I think Noam was absolutely brilliant to say that. And even if he only said that thing, it would be a huge step forward. And we're all, so in addition to his politics, which I think is good, it's speaking truth to power and all that, I think the idea that language is part of human nature, part of our endowment, and every child is born with the capacity to acquire language remarkably quickly, despite its complexities, that's a brilliant idea. So, and to say he's a buffoon, some people have tried that. My book's published by Yale University Press. I don't think they would have published a book saying Chomsky's a buffoon. It wouldn't get you anywhere, and I don't see that.
I think I understand.
Excuse. Yeah, it's. I'd rather.
All right. Okay, we'll have a chat. Let's have a chat.
Yeah.
After. Okay, let's have a chat after.
Yeah.
Now, what else have we got to do? Okay, 2 Chomskys. Can I just read out, because on the 2 Chomskys, it's just that what I'm trying to point out here is that it's a bit different from Trotsky, because Trotsky never went around saying there are 2 Trotskys, as far as I'm aware. I don't think Marx went around saying there are 2 Marxes, or Engels went around saying there are 2 Engelses. It's just that Chomsky is explicit about the 2 Chomskys, and I just think why don't we take his word for it? Why say there's one of them when Chomsky says there are 2? Again and again, Chomsky has stressed that the 2 great temptations in his life, his politics and his science, pulled him in opposite directions. He says I've tried to get at the 2, but it never works. My 2 interests just don't seem to merge. Chomsky views his hectic life, therefore, as a sort of schizophrenic existence. He uses the word schizophrenia to describe the flitting through the property, and he says it's made possible by a fortunate glitch in his brain, which he says it causes my brain to function like separate buffers in a computer. Well, why don't we hear the man? He's saying this to us, and he wants us to listen to him. And he gets a bit irritated when the anarchists and other people, they say, no, John, no, you're one person, and we love your
politics, and therefore we love your linguistics. And poor old Noam said, no. You've got to understand, the linguistics is different. You don't need the linguistics. It's done for a different purpose with a different part of our brain. Why don't we pay the man some respect? He says there are two. He was asked, by the way, what do the two Chomskys say to each other? And he says they don't have anything to say. It's all in the interviews. It's all in the record. You may think you want to go to the sources and send it to my book, but you won't find the sources very quickly. You have to spend 20 years on it unless you use my book as a guide to the sources. I'm a fairly conscientious academic. I wouldn't make it up. It's all in here. So I don't think he's a buffoon. And on the question of the two Chomskys, he says it himself, and I think we should respect that. Is there anything else I need to say? Yes. When he says that, the thing I haven't really stressed, although it's very central to my book, is what he was actually employed to do. So Noam Chomsky was employed to work on a language machine. If I could I could quote, but I won't bother to quote. It was a black box, and the idea was you'd put it in a rocket, and it would have universal grammar in it. And the input would be any language, and the output would be what you instructed the machine to do. So it was a universal language machine, and the idea is you put this thing in a rocket or some other weapon, and you're in Vietnam, you're talking the vernacular, it doesn't matter what your accent, what your language, you say, hit them commies, go right, go left, they're not there, you fucking idiot, hit them, they're over there, the Viet Cong, get them. And this machine, because it's got universal grammar, it will understand any language in the world, because it's got universal grammar, and it will translate it into its own machine code, so that the commanders on the ground don't have to learn these difficult computer languages. So Chomsky was interviewed for the job, and he was a bit sceptical whether this would ever work, but he said, I'll work on the theory of this. I probably won't be able to build your actual machine, but the kind of theory to work out what languages are in order to be able to build this machine, I'll work on it. He came up with one model, it's called syntactic structures, didn't seem to work. He came up with another model called aspects of the theory of syntax, that was called the standard theory, didn't seem to work. People found all kinds of holes in it, pretty useless actually. So he had the extended standard theory, played around with it, didn't seem to work, gave up on the extended standard. He came up with a revised extended standard theory, didn't seem to work. Chuck all that then, what about government of binding, what about, he keeps on finding that he can't design this universal language machine. I'll tell you why, because it's impossible. The machine would have to have a sense of humour, for example. No robot can ever be invented with a sense of humour. It will never ever happen. No machine will ever be able to say something and mean another for the computer that receives the instruction to work out from life experience and the environment what the hell it means. So I'm just saying the thing he offered to do for the military was a pipe dream. The military thought it was worth a try. End.